In today's lesson, we will be examining language, its impact on culture, and the effect of lessening language diversity globally. In many ways, language is power. Being able to speak the language of the rich and powerful gives you a lot of advantages. And on the flip side, some forms of knowledge inevitably are lost every time a language goes extinct. And in today's lesson, we're going to be covering the following. We'll start by looking at statistics to get a sense of what language looks like in 2016. Second, we will look at what is meant by language endangerment and extinction. Third, we will examine the factors which lead to language endangerment and extinction. Fourth, we will explore current trends in global language. And finally, we'll conclude by looking at Canadian language trends and issues in more detail. So just to start off here is a quote from an Indigenous elder, Wayne Newell. It says, "Language is the roadmap to culture." And so this is an important way of looking at language and its role in society. Language says a lot about who you are. It's a way of defining communities. It's something that a community has in common, a way of communicating with one another. And there's a lot of knowledge that is contained within languages, particularly when we're talking about indigenous languages. Many languages are not written down. So a lot of traditional knowledge that may have been passed down from generation to generation could be lost if that language were to go extinct. Another way of looking at language. So this cartoon here, I just want to look at this really quick. So it says, "This happened to my friend. English should be the national language. These immigrants should have to learn English when they come here." And the friend says, "Yeah. When you go live somewhere, you learn the language they speak there. English is the language of the land." And then one of their friends says, "Excuse me, but," and says something in another language. "What the hell was that?" "It's Cherokee." So this cartoon's really challenging our notions of what the dominant language should look like in a place like Canada or the US. It makes us question why a language like English has won out and why we think of it as the first language of the land, even though it's only been spoken here for a few hundred years. And there were lots of other indigenous languages that came before English. And really, if we're thinking about why English has won out and why it's so prevalent, it's not because of any technical aspect of English. English is not an easy language to learn. It has many weird or even contradictory rules. So it can be hard for someone learning the language. It can be hard to translate into other languages. If we were starting from scratch, we probably wouldn't pick English as the language that we all spoke. But that's the situation that we have to deal with. And one of the big reasons why English is so prevalent is, again, that history of colonialism. So remember, the British were all over the world. The sun never set on the British Empire. So it was spread globally. And if we were to look at which country has the most English speakers in the world, it's not the United States, it's not Great Britain, it's actually India. And now with global trade and the internet, there's even more pressure to have common languages throughout the world. And English is definitely one of those that have won out. And it's a convenient choice because it's spoken on all different continents. It's an easy middle ground for people to have. It pays to speak English. There's a lot of power associated with that. At many places around the world, English is the language of business. It's the language of government. It's the language of power. But on the flip side, when you're a speaker of a smaller language, you're often marginalized. So imagine you're the last person who speaks your language. No one else knows the same songs that you do. No one says hello in the same way. No one uses your names for plants and animals. The jokes you tell are never as funny when you have to translate them. There's a lot less power when you're a speaker of a smaller language. And when we look at language globally, about half of the languages that are spoken in the world today are in danger of extinction. So these are languages which are still living, people still speak them, people still use these as a way to define their communities and to communicate with one another, but half the languages around the world are in danger of extinction. And this is not concentrated in any one particular region, this is a global phenomenon. We see this on every continent. And with that fact in mind, let's look at some other key language facts. So in 2016, there are approximately 7,000 languages spoken in the world. More than half have no written form. Half of the world's languages are spoken in either Asia or the Pacific Islands. 50% of the world's languages are spoken in only 8 countries. And 96% of the world's languages are spoken by only 4% of the world's population. So although there is language diversity and language endangerment on every continent, there is some concentration geographically. So we see in Asia, Africa, and Oceania in particular, there's the most endangerment and diversity of language. So let's look at the South Pacific Islands as an example. So the South Pacific has 19% of the world's languages, which would work out to about 1,300 different and unique languages. But it only has about 0.5% of the world population, or about 35 million people. So what this means is that these small languages have, on average, fewer speakers, far fewer speakers. And again, this is making up a large percentage of the languages in the world. And this puts them at even greater risk of endangerment and extinction. If there are these pressures to speak one of the larger languages, again, because there's power invested in that. If there are fewer speakers of your language to begin with, there's fewer people to carry on that tradition. And so as generation by generation goes by, fewer and fewer people pass on that knowledge, that language becomes more likely to become extinct. Now, why do languages matter? Now, some would argue that they don't really matter. That with forces like globalization and the internet so prevalent in the modern day, we're inevitably moving towards a future with fewer and fewer languages. Some people have argued that in, a few centuries, we might only speak 1 or 2 different languages in the world. And that's one perspective. But on the flip side, there's many positive aspects to language diversity. We have culture that comes out of language, and that shared sense of community that comes out of it. Things like songs and traditions that are based around that language. Traditional ecological knowledge that might be passed along with language. So for example, many indigenous groups that have lived in an area, lived off the land for thousands of years, they might know things about the local ecology that modern science hasn't had time to study yet. And so that kind of knowledge, which a lot of scientists are able to, go into those communities and learn about different species that live in the area that they might not be familiar with at the current time because they haven't had the time or the money to study it. If that language goes away, they lose that knowledge base. That knowledge is gone forever. And so that leads us into this idea of language endangerment. So on average, a language dies every 14 days. Half of the world's languages are expected to go extinct by the end of the 21st century. And as we said, many languages have no recorded form, and they've never been recorded. There's no books written in this language, there are no sound recordings, there's nothing. So if the last speaker of this language were to die, all the knowledge contained in that language would be gone forever. So a language dies when the last speaker of that language dies. And again, the world loses the knowledge contained in that language. But even before the last speaker dies, a language is functionally extinct when it no longer defines a community. So once it can no longer communicate information in a meaningful way within a community, it's no longer an active language. It's no longer a useful language. So for example, something like Latin. Latin is a dead language. It's no longer a defining factor of any community. No one speaks Latin as their mother tongue anymore. Even though there are people who still speak it or can understand it, it's no longer a mother tongue for anyone. Now this map here is showing us where languages are endangered of going extinct. Some hotspots geographically. And most of these are indigenous languages. They're smaller, in many cases marginalized groups. And so one area in particular that we can see here is in the Pacific Northwest, so areas like British Columbia and the Northwest U.S., Washington State, Oregon. A lot of indigenous languages are in severe threat of becoming extinct, again, because a lot of these pressures being put on them. Now, with that in mind, let's look at some of the factors that contribute to language endangerment and extinction. Now, there are many factors that can lead to a language being endangered or extinct. And this is not an exhaustive list, but here are some ideas. So one might be globalization, the fact that the world is more interconnected, and it's easier to communicate with people all over the world if we have a common language or common languages. Urbanization is a big factor. The fact that more and more people are living in cities these days means that there's more of a need for common languages. It's no longer the case where you might have in a country dozens of different languages spoken. Those tend to coalesce around one or two main languages in a region. There's the allure of speaking a modern language. Intergenerational transmission might be interrupted. So, for example, in Canada, residential schools played a big role in this. When Indigenous people were sent off to school at a young age at residential schools, not only were they not encouraged to speak their language, they were not allowed to speak their language at all. The purpose of it was to kill that culture in those communities. It could be state policies, so compulsory language schooling, sending kids to school and making them learn a certain language, whether that's English or another language. There are many socioeconomic factors at play. Again, a lot of these smaller languages are spoken by groups that are already marginalized. So there are many factors working against them in that way. Religion plays a big role. So being able to speak the language of a religion might be a factor that leads towards these big languages being spoken. So thinking of like Arabic being spoken in Islamic communities. Latin used to be very important in Catholicism in particular. Migration patterns are going to have an effect on this. As people from diverse communities come together, they might have originally spoken different languages, and they need a common tongue to understand each other. And finally, education. A lot of education is done in one of these big languages, English, for example. So if you want to go into higher education in a lot of places around the world, you need to speak a language like English in order to, do research and to get funding and to, communicate with others in your field around the world. So what are the trends in language globally? So now we're going to look at 4 trends in particular in more detail. The first trend is that big languages are getting bigger. So this chart here is showing us a list of the most widely spoken languages in the world. So we have Chinese, specifically Mandarin Chinese, as the most spoken language in the world. And then Spanish and English are the next 2 most commonly spoken. Spanish actually has more mother tongue speakers than English, but English has more total speakers. More people speak it as a second language. And then other languages like Hindi, Bengali, French, Arabic, Russian, Portuguese, Punjabi, German, with many, many speakers, hundreds of millions. And this second chart here down in the bottom right is showing us the proportion of secondary speakers. So these are people who have this language as a second language. And you can see there's a lot of overlap between these 2 charts. These are, again, represent a very small percentage of the total number of languages in the world. 7,000 in total, and yet the vast majority are speaking one of these few languages. There's not a lot of pressure to learn any of the smaller languages, but there's a lot of pressure to learn these big ones. So these big languages are getting much bigger. On the flip side, smaller languages are getting even smaller and they're dying out. So 50% of languages are spoken by only 0.2% of the world's population. So on average, there's fewer speakers to begin with. So as they die out, the language dies out. On the flip side, at the bottom of this pyramid here, the 83 largest languages in the world are spoken by almost 80% of the world's population. So again, about 1% of the world's languages are spoken by 80% of the people. So it's an uneven distribution. Our third trend, language diversity, is unevenly spread. So some parts of the world have been more heavily affected by the spread of large languages than others. Languages and the anthropology behind language, the study of linguistics, we can actually trace back sort of common origins of languages. And that's something we would call language diversity, how much similarity languages have with each other. And just to give you an example of this, so for example, in Bolivia, there are 36 languages spoken in Bolivia, and they belong to 17 different what we would call genetic units, or sort of origins, commonalities between these languages. So not only are there lots of different languages in the country of Bolivia, but those languages themselves are very different than one another. On the other hand, Europe has 164 different languages spoken. However, they belong to only 18 different genetic units. So even though there's more total languages spoken, they're very closely related to one another. So for example, it's really easy to learn Spanish or Italian if you already know French, because there's a lot of similarities between the languages. A lot of the root words are the same, and the way you conjugate verbs is really similar. So when they have these sorts of similarities already, there's a lot of similarities. It's easy to learn that language, but they're not very diverse from one another. That wouldn't be the case in a country like Bolivia. They have almost the same number of genetic units. And our fourth and final trend. Technology is being used to preserve language for these smaller languages. So there's many projects underway that are attempting to record languages, especially those that don't have a written form. National Geographic, for example, has done put a lot of effort into recording these languages to try to preserve them for future generations, so that future anthropologists might be able to use this information for whatever purposes they might need. That kind of brings us back to this catch-22 of technology. Technology is one of the driving factors behind why these languages are going extinct in the first place, but it also offers a glimpse of hope, a way for them to be recorded and to be preserved throughout time. Now, with the global trends in mind, let's think about what this looks like in Canada. So let's take a case study of language trends in Canada. So we're going to be looking at data from the 2011 census. Unfortunately, the 2016 data was not available at the time of this recording. This Canadian census is done once every 5 years. So this gives us a general idea, though, of some of the trends that are ongoing. So in 2011, more than 200 different languages were spoken at home. And we're talking about the primary language that is used at home. 80% of those who reported speaking a immigrant language, quote unquote, at home, so a language other than English, French, or an indigenous language, lived in one of Canada's 6 largest metropolitan areas. Tagalog, which is a Philippine-based language, saw the biggest increase in home speakers from 2006 to 2011. It saw a 64% increase. And in Toronto and Vancouver, the number of English speakers at home showed a steady decline. And so this first chart here is showing us the increase in those languages spoken at home. So you can see Mandarin second, Arabic is third, Hindi fourth. Again, these are languages that are seeing the biggest increase. And again, this is the primary language that's being used to communicate information at home. This graph here is showing us the distribution of the mother tongue. So we can see here, English still makes up the majority in the Greater Toronto Area. However, it's just over 50%. It was 56% in 2006 and 57% in 2011. So a majority, but just barely. And so that means that more than 2 out of every 5 people in Toronto speak a language other than English at home. And so this graph here is showing us the distribution of non-English languages at home. So we can see that Chinese is the largest. And Punjabi has shown a lot of growth in that time as well. Now, whether or not this is always going to be the case, well, probably not. So we can see groups like, Chinese, Indian, they're first-generation immigrants. There's a lot of first-generation immigrants, at least, people who have moved over to Canada but were born in other countries. But their kids are now growing up in Canada. So whether or not their generation is going to speak Chinese, or Punjabi at home? That remains to be seen. And we can see with some of these other groups. So, for example, Italian. If we were to look back 100 years ago, there would have been a lot of speakers of Italian at home because they're first generation immigrants. They're living in a big city like Toronto. They're still speaking that at home. But as each generation goes on, fewer and fewer may speak that at home, and they adopt English as their primary mother tongue. That's the trend that we see, at least. Another trend in Canada is Indigenous language rights. There's many attempts to preserve language in Canada. So again, remember that legacy of residential schools. Not only were Indigenous groups not encouraged to preserve their language, it was being forcefully taken away from them. There were consequences for speaking your language. Physical abuse, for example. People would be beaten if they were spoken their native tongue in a residential school. And this was not a side effect. This was the purpose of residential schools, to take away that culture from Indigenous people. Today, there's a lot being done to try to rectify that, especially by Indigenous activists. So one such project here is the First Voices Project, and its purpose is to archive language and encourage the use of Indigenous languages at home. And there's actually been a push from some Indigenous activists to make some Indigenous languages official languages in Canada, along with English and French. So what that would do, it would give a lot of rights to people who spoke that language. So think of like legal rights, for example. In Canada, you can have a trial in either English or French. This would give speakers of some of these languages perhaps some of those rights. There are certain political rights that go along with that. It hasn't really gone anywhere, but there's been some talk in activist communities about perhaps pursuing this in the future. And so in summary, language plays a big role in shaping cultures and defining communities. As of 2016, there are about 7,000 living languages in the world, but about half of these languages are endangered. A language becomes extinct when the last living speaker dies. There are many factors that contribute to language extinction, including globalization, urbanization, education, and migration. A handful of large languages, such as English and Mandarin, are growing in speakers, while small languages get smaller and die. Technology can play an important role in preserving language, and while English remains the most common mother tongue in Canada, language is diversifying due to immigration, especially in large urban areas.